So, hi everyone. Marcel gave you a comprehensive report, sort of, on Slack. So I just wanted to briefly summarize what we did yesterday. So we worked with Soapbox team, John, Naomi, and Ellen, on brand and strategy. We focused on how to develop or implement brand-centered communication for think tanks. And I think it's really useful that we did manage to do it with Soapbox because they specialize in think tank communication brandings, and they have developed a prominence, let's say, at the European level, and they have offices all around the world. So, three key takeaways from branding and think tanks is that the brand should unify our organization and help it become what it aspires to be, but also communicate their values and what it stands for. So it's not just a visual representation. It should be, sexy and appealing, but also communicates values and what we do and what we aim to achieve. Second thing is that it helps us legitimize the debate around us. It sends right message for the right audiences. So I think I really like this formulation that you have established yourself as a think tank if there is a debate and somebody asks why X or epsilon is not present there. And this significantly reduces the legitimacy of that kind of debate if we are not present there. I found this is a really useful indicator of our importance or the policy impact that we make as think tanks. And finally, to be able to kind of what we at communication studies used to call massage the message, to kind of adapt message to different audiences that we are targeting, because every message at the same time should conjure up an image. I think these were the words that some of the people used yesterday. So just briefly to summarize the exercises that we did a lot of work in breakout rooms. So I mean, I might not speak for all of you guys, but I really enjoyed our work. So we divided our workshops in parts. First things we did was we mapped types of activities that we did. Second, we did try to define who do we do it for, defining target groups. These two exercises were relatively easy. But the third one, defining the purpose of why we do things the way we do, it was very difficult because we spent a lot of time trying to narrow down the focus of our work or expand it. So for example, instead of saying that Europe that is based on policy, evidence-informed policy, that should be our vision. We want Germany with market economy that is inclusive of all societies, and so it was a bit difficult to find the right scope of our purpose and to focus it properly without limiting ourselves necessarily to some policy areas. Next, we did a definition of personality, try to define what are key traits that we like to see ourselves. And then again, it was a debate between, do we make ourselves very boring? So we are smart, precise, technical, or do we also communicate some values about what we want to achieve and how we want to be looked at by our audiences? Visual identity was my favorite part of the exercise. This is the fifth part, where we try to define the font, image, colors that we like to use for our think tanks. And I think it was a really good exercise to kind of think outside of our usual think tank box, where we think in terms of legal clauses and words, and to kind of move into this more visual space. And I think Ellen complimented our group for really good work, so I'm really pleased with that. And finally, we did some work on communication approaches and how to conduct brand interactions with our external audiences. But again, this was less interesting because this is what we do on our daily basis. And finally, we did some group discussions, and I think based on the presentations that most of the groups actually enjoyed the work quite a lot. So kudos for John, Naomi, and Ellen and the Soapbox team for the work they did with us.
Thank you for that succinct and jam-packed summary. I would like to highlight one point that you said, that the difficulty of finding your scope and defining what you want to do. And I think that's a key aspect that you need to work on your organizations, to really define what you want to do. And I think it touches upon a bit what Keith is going to do today. So thank you, Bojan, for a great and greatly delivered summary. So thank you. And now Now we would like to, sorry, let me move the spotlight here. I'd like to welcome today Keith Burnet with us for his third School for Thinktankers. Keith is Director of Communications and Publishing at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, where he oversees its communication strategy and outreach and has overall responsibility for the Institute's magazine, The World Today, and the journal International Affairs. His previous marketing and communications related roles include for Wood Mackenzie & Co., NatWest Securities, Wiley Blackwell, the Industrial Society, the Disabled Men Income Group, and the Labour Party. He studied business and politics at Oxford Brookes University and the Curtin University, Western Australia.
Thank you, as always, and thanks, Bojan. That was really interesting introduction, and I know that the work every time Chatham House works with Soapbox, we get good results. So, I am going to share my screen, and I think is it up to me to do it? Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I will do it now. I have talking about boring. I have a slide with lots of words written. I have slides with lots of words written on them, and I feel free to minimize the screen, enlarge the gallery if you can, and more importantly, feel free to interrupt, to ask questions. I mean, if you put comments in the chat, that's great, but I'm less likely to see them as I talk through each slide. But I'll start. So, a little bit about me. I've been at Chatham House for a long time. Over the 20 years I've been there, the organization has changed and evolved a lot, and our communication strategies have changed and evolved, as has much of the focus of our work. But I'll come on to some of that in the presentation. And I will start with a little bit on Chatham House, just to give you a bit of background. Maybe some of you have heard of us, maybe some not. But the structure of the presentation will be around communication strategies. And we're going to start with a very basic question, which is why and how. Why do you need one? Do you need one? How much detail do you need to go into? The three key elements that we will focus on are the objectives, the strategies, and the tactics. What's the difference? You know the difference. It's important. I'll focus on those. Then for any communication strategy, communications plan, there are 5 key components. So I will outline those, and then we'll do a bit of a small exercise, which will maybe take 15 or 20 minutes at the end. Then we'll share results, and we'll do that individually. And so we'll start that probably in about 30 minutes or so. So just to say, first of all, that I want this to be as interactive as possible. When we're in Geneva, it's great because you can wander around the room, get eye contact. I can, just ask people. People feel much more relaxed, I think, about interrupting. But here, please feel free to unmute and ask, and ask for clarification. Disagree, it's fine. If it doesn't make sense, then please say so. And I'll talk a little bit about Chatham House, and maybe in the Q&A there'll be some sensitive information or information that's specific about the think tank. That's fine. I just say, please be careful if you're sharing things on social media. But please keep it interactive and interrupt and ask questions if you feel it's appropriate. So very briefly, I'm going to give you an overview of Chatham House. Chatham House is formally called the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's an international affairs think tank founded in 1920, so we're just over 100 years old. And we were founded at a time when there weren't any think tanks or any organizations that were researching international affairs. There was one international relations course at a university in Wales, but there were no organizations, unlike in the medicine sciences, where there were bodies and groups and organizations for the specific study of those topics. There wasn't anything on international affairs. So in that sense, it was a unique idea that the Institute came from. And throughout our history, we have always tried to focus and retain our independence from government, of course, but independence from funders. And that rings true, more true today. But I'm sure for most of you, and many think tanks claim to be independent, and that's great, especially the ones that are. But for us, and I think for all of you, it's increasingly important that you're transparent about your funding, about your goals, about your supporters, what you're trying to achieve. So I always add that now when I'm describing the organization, that we try to be as transparent as possible. Our mission is lofty and worthy, to deliver a sustainably secure, prosperous and just world, which is quite heavy language sometimes. So what does that mean in practice? Well, we undertake debate, we host dialogue, our research and analysis is as rigorous and credible as it can be, and broadly we're viewed as a trusted source of information. But that description is a little bit dry. What are we trying to do? We want to change the world. We want to make it better. We are offering governments, societies, civil society, we're offering them solutions-focused ideas. And we're about equality and diversity as an organization, and diversity in the way that we undertake our work. And some of this will come out in the course of the presentation. So do we put our money where our mouth is? Yes, we do. This is a screenshot from last week or the week before, where we had the inaugural meeting of our panel of young advisors. We already have, and for many years, we've had a panel of senior advisors. And that's chaired by the former UK Prime Minister, Sir John Major. You might expect, I think, a tank like Chatham House to have the former Prime Minister chairing a panel of senior advisors to guide and direct us. But this is a new initiative. The panel of young advisors is there to help us with diversity, to help us internationalize, to help us with a strategy when we're reaching out to younger audiences on social media and so on. So for any think tank, you need to be not only putting your money where your mouth is, but you need to be communicating what you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to achieve it. This is part of a project we're working on at the moment. This is a mock-up design, and we're trying to find solutions for homes that flood. And it's part of a project called the London Design Biennale within our collab. And this might be a little bit unexpected. It's like, think tanks need an element of surprise. And I hope that this project, and there's another one we're working on at the moment called Piccadilly Circus in 2121. So we're trying to imagine the future of the city centre, and we're developing an immersive experience to give people that, to give people the insights that they might not otherwise from a report or from an event. So trying to live what we say we're doing, which is trying to change the world, is becoming very important for Chatham House, for other think tanks too. Really boring bit is how we're structured. I'm sure most of you are very similar. We have a research department, external relations is where membership sits, and the conference unit and events. We have a communications team, and we have HR, IT, facilities supporting us. And that's changing at the moment, because recently we launched an academy that again is a focus on future leaders, developing the skills and talent that policymakers and others are going to need in the future to help guide better policy. And I mentioned the collab. That's a new initiative whereby we're developing online digital experiences. We're bringing people from outside of Chatham House into Chatham House to work alongside our experts to create new content, to deliver new types of event even. And again, the focus isn't exclusively on the next generation, but it's by default almost going to attract a younger, more diverse audience. The communications department, just very briefly, as Andrea said, we have a magazine, a journal, The World Today, International Affairs. The core of the team is made up of the publishing and brand team, where the editors sit. We have a press office, we have a digital content team who manage the social media channels and create content, multimedia for those channels. And then I've added in next generation. We have the collab, we have a project called Common Futures, which brings together youth from Europe and Africa. We have the panel of young advisors, and we're on a push, not just within the department, but across the organization, to attract and diversify our outputs and audiences. So now to the meat of this presentation, and we're going to ask, first of all, why? Why do you have a communication strategy? It may seem obvious, but if you ask your colleagues, they may not know, they may not think. So it's good for every one of you to have a sense of why you would want to develop and create a communication strategy. So the first thing is it's going to help you deliver your objectives. You have to be clear on your objectives, of course, but it's going to help you deliver and focus on what it is you're trying to achieve. And you always need a clarity of purpose for whatever activity you're undertaking, big or small. You need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So it will help you with planning. It will help you, really importantly, focus on your resources, because there is no way I could believe that any of you have an abundance of resources and abundance of time. So always useful to drill down, help you focus on resources. Crucially, you need to know the audiences. So define your audiences at the outset, what you're trying to achieve. Have to be realistic, not just defining your audiences and everything else you're trying to do, but also with what you would see as your measurements of success. So we'll come on to sort of specific examples of that. But how do you develop a strategy? Well, it's teamwork. It's always a cross-organization effort. It's not just down to one person to sit and create your strategy, but you need to agree the objectives up front. You need to write it down. Always write it down. There can be flexibility in what you write down, but be very clear about what you're trying to achieve on paper. You stick with the implementation and the delivery throughout, even though sometimes it's easy to get distracted, sometimes it's easy to shift focus, but stick with your focus and make sure that you're delivering what you set out to achieve. And then learning lessons will come through the evaluation process, and you can build in strategies and tactics to enable evaluation throughout. But again, this is going to be a very important part of any communication strategy. So I'm going to start with a few basics. There are three elements. Three elements are the objectives, the strategy, and tactics. Be very clear about your ultimate objective and goal. And I'm going to give an example. And I realized it was too late this morning when I sent the slides in to Andrea. I thought, I'm not going to give this example again. It's 25 years old, but it rings true, and it partly rings true because when I worked in the Labour Party, and Alistair Campbell, who was the communications director then, was so big on strategy. And the reason this was in the UK in the 1990s, so I appreciate it doesn't mean much to most of you. But for any political party, the objective was to win the general election. The strategy, as he always said time after time, was New Labour, New Britain. And what that meant was that the Labour Party was seen as out of touch, dated, hadn't won a general election for 4 or 5 times, and people were just reluctant to vote. But the vision of the UK, which was leaning into Europe, it was modern, it was young, it was dynamic, it was a focus on education. So New Labour, New Britain described basically everything that everyone who worked in the party should be doing and feeding into. And if it looked old-fashioned, then it shouldn't have been there. And then there were many tactics, but they had a pledge card where they were focusing on education, on defence, on the National Health Service, and these are our 5 pledges to the people of the UK. They used data seat by seat, so they knew the key seats they wanted to win, and they listened to the audience, they listened to the focus groups. Now again, this was a long time ago, and some of this was very new at the time, so that's partly why it stuck with me. But it's also partly stuck with me because it works. And I would just say, bring it back to something simple. Let's say your objective is to lose weight, to get fit. You want to lose 20 kilo. Your strategy is eat less, move more. So whatever you're doing, you're watching what you eat and you're exercising. And then the tactics could be varied, but you're going to cycle instead of taking a train. You're going to cut out chocolate. You're going to home cook, but you're going to home cook in a healthy way. So those 3 elements are what you would be focusing on. You know what your end goal is. That's the easy part. Your strategy should almost describe everything you do. If it doesn't, if you're somehow eating more and moving less, then you're doing something wrong from the start. And then the tactics, you enter lockdown, so you're not going to cycle to work, but you'll find an alternative. So just keep those three things in mind. And the first one could be the first goal. The goal should be relatively straightforward. You should know what the bottom line is that you want to achieve. And it could be big or small, but you stick to the objective. Strategy is, of course, much more complicated than 4 words. But again, if you can coalesce around a core idea and a concept, and the stuff that comes or that might distract you, if it's not part of that, then it's not part of the strategy. And tactics, you need flexibility. But again, tactics, you can work out and change, but again, they should all be feeding into the ultimate objective and the strategy. So what do? When you're formulating the plan, first thing, write it down. It could be a report or it could be 1 page, but you write it down and you keep your focus. You discuss and argue. You be realistic about what you're trying to achieve. You must bring colleagues on board. So that's not just in terms of teamwork, but that's in terms of, are you doing the right thing? Never be afraid to discuss it with colleagues. Never be afraid to bring it up in meetings and repeat what you're trying to achieve. You will always need analysis, understanding, knowledge, and the more people you're bringing into that circle, the better. Action, not theory. You've got to get on with it at some point. You've got to implement, you've got to act, you've got to follow up, you've got to persist. All of these things are important. And never forget that communications is a means to an end. What you're really trying to achieve is, get more followers on Twitter, get a government to change a policy. Whatever the end is, don't lose sight of that. Communications can be fun, it can be a trial, it can be challenging, but ultimately it's there for a purpose, and don't lose sight of that purpose. And again, as with the tactics, you want to be consistent, but you're perfectly allowed to be flexible and to change as perhaps circumstances change. So I was just, if you'll indulge me a little bit, I was thinking about Chatham House and the time I've been there. And I think there are probably 4 different stages of the key objectives from a communications perspective. And when I joined the organization, its profile was low. It had gone through a pretty bad patch of funding and visibility. I inherited, not a big team. It was me and one other person. There's now 26 of us, but the organization's grown, not just the department. But initially, the challenge was most people hadn't heard of what was then branded the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And although people called the organization Chatham House, there was a lot of international affairs in the news. We were just about to head up to 9/11, and so I didn't know that at the time, but there was a desire from the directors, from the council, to make the organization visible. Now, how do you do that? I took the approach that you respond and you react to every request. You make your experts available. We didn't have a huge number of experts. The staff then was maybe 50 or 60 people. It's now nearly 200. And we've always had a bank of associate fellows to draw on. We had a few good associate fellows, but most of the staff were academics. They were sometimes reluctant to appear in the media. So the challenge was to push people as much as they were comfortable being pushed, to make sure they had a profile, to make sure, really importantly, from the press office side, that we responded and we reacted to everyone and everything. We treated people equally. We treated all outlets the same, because everyone is a hit. And even if it's local radio, even if it's a small newspaper, it's still important, because when you think about a journalist, evolve, they move, they might go from a small newspaper to a large one, and they will remember you. They will take you with you, as it were. So the focus for us at that time was profile and visibility. And what do? You react, you respond, and you do as much as you can to get your experts and to make them available and to make them understand that it's important for them to be available. And then over time, you realize, well, actually, we have loads of calls at night time and the weekend, because they know we're reactive. They know we will respond, and that's fine, but ultimately that might not help the organization in its wider objectives and strategy. So as they evolved, so did the comms strategy. And then we started to be a lot more focused and targeted, and we started to say no. We started to direct experts at a few selected outlets. We would target, for example, we do everything we can to get an op-ed in the Financial Times or the New York Times, and we would still do that. But it was a slight shift from work on what you can work on to be more focused. Then over time, and this is probably more recently, this is probably in the last 7 or 8 years, we've become a lot more audience focused. And we realized quite quickly within the department that the last time we redeveloped the website, we made a mistake because we were listening to external audiences a little bit, but internal colleagues a lot more. And when we launched the website, it was fine. It reflected the structure of the organization, but ultimately that was not the way that users were coming to the site. They didn't care how many departments we had. They didn't care about the structure of the website. All they wanted was to find the content. So that was a sort of fairly tough lesson. But I would say in the intervening years, we have at all times, and in a good way, this isn't about clickbait. This is just about being thoughtful and strategic about who you're trying to reach and how you're trying to reach them. So I would say that we have shifted as an organization, and we have a new deputy director now, and she is very focused on impact and reaching policymakers. So I feel that we have a structure and we have our kind of cultural buy-in now that means that people do. It's kind of, I wouldn't say first, last, and always, but audience and outputs and what you're trying to achieve should always be part of, the content as you're developing it, the content as you're promoting it, the content as you're, assessing and measuring it. And then the final phase, I would say, is where we are now, which is more about diversifying not just our audiences, as I touched on, but our outputs, our platforms, our channels, our partnerships. That's really important to us, and never let a good crisis go to waste. We have doubled down on our ability now to reach out internationally. The Asia Pacific program are running events online in ways that we'd never have dreamed of doing, but they can get great people. They can get great people to come and attend and speak at an event, whereas a year ago, we wouldn't have had those people because they weren't in London. So, diversifying our audience, make sure we're reacting and responding, as well as being a bit ahead of the curve. And I put immersive because that is one of the challenges for our content. Our content is still very heavily based on the written word. It's still pretty traditional outreach on social media and so on. And that's why we're developing what we're calling more immersive experiences, both in person, when we get back into the building, we have the simulation center, we have the collab space, but you really need to involve the audience. You need to draw on them as well as just present to them. Okay, so for any communications strategy, I'm identifying 5 key elements, and these are based around the outputs. And I think you're all familiar with, for everything from the printed report to Twitter cards and everything in the middle. The audiences are critical. The channels that you're using, the frequency, of course, depending on what you're trying to communicate and how you're trying to communicate, and then the measurement. So those 5 components, and when we come to the exercise, fairly soon, we come to the exercise, I want to keep those 5 components in mind. So I'm just going to go through them one by one. And please, if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to interrupt and ask. So for outputs, we publish such a vast array of outputs. And, from microsite landing page to report and the long read, output, op-eds, we're creating multimedia all the time. And now the events are not just in-person events, they're on the screen. So for each output, you need to identify what you're trying to achieve. And I don't know how many of you, or so maybe I'm going to ask a question. How many of you are in comms, or how many of you from your organization will have an in-house discussion about the final outputs that the communications department is going to communicate? Is it a researcher says we have funding and I have to write a report, or is there a process of consultation internally? Can I just ask if anybody wants to unmute and volunteer how your think tank decides on which outputs it's going to create?
I'm just gonna go ahead. If nobody else wants to.
Hello, thank you.
Hi, Keith. I'm Marcel. I'm from the funders organization, the Robert Bosch Foundation, which is also partnering with Chatham House.
Indeed.
And yeah, I mean, not being a think tank, but we still have a lot of communications about the output we produce, and in that there is a back and forth between our comms department and the people working on content, just making sure what the messaging is and trying to get the messaging right, to also fit in, well, does it reflect the content accurately, but also where do we put the emphasis, who are we trying to reach, and how does it best feed back into our overall strategy?
Thank you. That's really good. And that's great practice, of course, a great organization. And that's almost what I would expect. But we still, it's certainly at Chatham House, we still find sometimes people come with a done deal, and it's not always the way. We had a conversation actually last week about the G7 that the UK is hosting, and the researcher had commissioned some pieces, but he just asked for like 4,000 words, hadn't really said if it was going to be a report or an article. And then when it comes to the department, and this is a priority for us, when it comes to the department, the story is much more around how are we going to get what we have into shape, much more, as opposed to something that's created with a specific audience or purpose in mind. So we still have that challenge, not all the time. And when we have bigger projects, we're certainly, as a comms department, involved in the planning at the outset, especially if it's a microsite, and that takes a lot of time and resource. So we have some way to go, but of course you must always identify the key outputs. Then you think about your audience, and sometimes you could be targeting one person or two people or a very small group of policymakers. Sometimes you need to reach out to impress, attract, keep on board your inner circle, your supporters. The media are perennials for us, and we're always looking. I mean, I don't think we publish a paper where we're not looking for some kind of general media coverage. Increasingly, our audiences are, appearing on or following us on social media, so we'll adapt, as I think you all will. We're interested in the interested public, and increasingly we are the website that we launched in October is targeted much more at a general audience. We are trying everything we can to be higher up on search engine rankings. We're soliciting and commissioning content that we know appeals to specific searches. That works sometimes, not always, but we know that there are perennials, and where there are perennials, or where there are very popular, relatively short-term searches on topics that we can respond to, then increasingly we're trying to create and curate content that will appeal to those audiences. So since the launch of the new website, we've seen our audiences up quite significantly, and there are new general audiences who are curious, but again, the challenge is that it's not clickbait. The challenge is that they are curious about our work because they want to read it, and the evidence is that actually that is happening. So target audiences, always important. Yes, Andrea, yes.
Sorry, we have a couple of questions that I wanted to
Please.
So there were some comments to your questions before. Sophie said that they do have a consultation. That she apologizes for the lack of microphone and camera. She said they have a consultation process with the comms publication team, telling the analysts what would be the best format and dissemination process. Then we have Diego.
So the question, I missed the first. So the question is,
she was sharing the case from her organization. She's based in Berlin. Then we have Diego from Brazil. He says, in my case, it's a small Brazilian think tank. We have a board of directors of 10 members. One of them handles comms. Outputs are discussed and decided by the board. So kind of a different approach. Then we have a question by Edgar saying, how do we examine the demand for these comms key outputs? I understand to identify the audience. How do you find what this audience really wants? And I echo that question. I wanted to know a bit more. How were you defining your audiences throughout these objectives, and how did you make the internal decisions of who were your audiences? And we have a lot of people, comments and questions. So as Keith said, if you want to ask, just raise your hands and speak. It would make it much better than me just reading all your questions.
Okay. Should I stop? Should I stop the share for a minute, and then I think maybe that's better. We get the gallery view. That's what I prefer. Yeah. Okay. So.
Russell, sorry, Sophie.
I'll start with the first. So it's really interesting that there's one person on the board, and that person does the comms. Now, look, like with any measurement, is that achieving what you want it to achieve? If it is, then fine. I would say that's unusual, and I would say that one person on the board is probably not the best person to, advise on social media channels or what the next generation is really thinking and doing, and how that group wants to access your work. But if it works for you, it works. If you're trying to change it, which I guess may be the root of the question, then perhaps a survey. I mean, how many of you survey your audiences? We didn't do it last year, but we tend to do an annual audience survey that gives us some really good insights. It's not by any means, scientific or comprehensive, but it gives us a really good direction and a sense of what people are, coming to the website for. They'll tell us about their own demographic, which is important because we don't always know that. But they will say, yeah, I would like to read more expert comments. I would like to access more of your content on video via your social media channels. And then, of course, there's all of the information that, for those of you who use social media monitoring or media monitoring tools, you get a lot of information back from those sources. But you can also just follow general trends. And I think I could have guessed that, well, actually, maybe I couldn't have, but on our Instagram account, which we're building up, and it's a relatively small audience of maybe about 10 or 12,000. And we came a little bit late to that, but we do realize that on Instagram, videos go down well. We know from this limited amount, of the audiences that they're likely to be younger, that they're likely to be women, or more likely to be women by about 55 to 45%. So we know that when something does well on that channel, then it's likely to appeal more to younger women. So if we want to attract younger women to our Twitter feed, then perhaps more videos or more of similar. So, and then I was going to mention survey. Yeah, I mean, you don't know, in a sense, what the demand is going to be for an output. And sometimes a researcher says, we're going to have a report and that's it. Well, that's fine, but you can pull elements from that report. You can make something of it. If you're able to create a short video or multimedia or an event around it, and then you can create different and new assets that are associated with what otherwise might be a relatively dry report. Now, I'm going to look again at the questions. Is there anything else, Andrea, that I'm...
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. There was one extra comment from Mohammed saying that in his think tank, 3 teams are involved in discussion on the output: the researchers, the comms, and the operations team.
Okay, so that sounds good. That sounds like a good team effort. But Mohammed, where do you work? Are you in the communications department or research, and how does it work for you?
Yeah, I'm the acting research director here, Shark Forum in Istanbul. And we have inputs from three different teams, one from researchers, one from the communication teams, and the other from operations. From researcher, we highlight the important topics. This paper is important. This event needs to be highlighted. From communications, they think with us about the appropriate channels, like social media will be enough. No, we need to have some hard copies and post them and all this stuff. The operations are responsible for the logistics, like
Yes.
outsourcing some teams for editing, for video production. So it's usually the three teams involved in this process.
Okay, that's interesting. And do you feel it works for you though?
Yeah, yeah.
It does work. And and are you always clear on your objectives? And you measure success and you track the audience and.
Yeah, actually, we have some comments, and we had like last year meeting. We had some problem in highlighting the indicators. For example, the page visits or the downloads are not quite enough to highlight our reach. Also, if we are approaching decision makers and politicians, how can we put some indicators for that?
Yeah.
So we are trying to find out some good indicators to put in our plan, but we're still negotiating that, suffering from finding appropriate indicators.
It's all, it is always painful. Enrique, how are you?
Hi, Keith. How are you? Nice to see you. I have a question, I think, related to this process. You might want to share with everybody. What is the role that the director of communications have on kind of deciding what those outputs are, or what the mix of communication outputs is going to be? So do you have a final say if it came down to the researcher and you about what is the best output, or what is the best timing to share that output or mix of outputs? Would Robin, the director of the head of Chatham House, would he say, Keith, you have the final say, or would it be okay, we'll go with the researcher? How does it work at Chatham House?
I think that it's probably safe to say that the researcher wins 90% of the time. But it doesn't usually come to a battle. There's what we've tried to do recently is that we need the comms team to get in earlier. Now there is a move. As I said, there's a new deputy director, and she's quite keen to make sure that the research departments who report to her are moving away, or at least thinking about moving away from the written word quite as much. We hold on to the written word quite a lot. And from a communications perspective, we hear, hey, we got funding for this project, and we've committed to producing 3 reports. Now that decision has been made, but as I said, where we're getting much better at, and where we have this collab initiative, whereby we can kind of swoop a little bit and we say, okay, that's fine. You have a report, and it's a good report, and it's technically a little bit dry, and we will try and lift from that. We will develop some assets from that report that we can post on social media that will help us. So you kind of get the best of both. But I can tell you, if it comes down to a kind of straight fight between research and comms, usually research wins in a good way. It's not it's like, okay, we can work with this. But again, from a communications perspective, please, don't just see what's in front of you and think that's it. That's, you need to, you can draw out from these things, and you can be creative, even without a huge amount of resources. Okay.
May I add?
I hope that's okay. Hi, Carlos.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you.
Raised hand. Hello.
Kid, my question is this one. Usually when we hear about comms strategies, we are, let's say, focused in the, let's say, communication moving from the think tank, from the researchers to the public, to the intended audiences. Yeah. But we feel that the role of the think tank is also moving this communication from the intended the stakeholders to the researcher in order to, let's say, really focus and inform our researchers in terms of what we need to research, what and the kind of impact that, let me put you an example. Medical doctors right now are having difficult times, but we have researchers outside of the battlefield, yeah, trying to produce policy recommendations through good communications, arriving to policymakers, but no one is in the battlefield. So tell us a little bit about this other side of communication, the communication coming.
I think that's such a good point, because we have all had to move, or should be moving, I think, from broadcasting our outputs to the world. And, with websites, that just because you build it, people will not necessarily come. You need to involve almost at every stage. And one of the reasons I mentioned the panel of young advisors is because one of our objectives is it's not just about reaching young people or doctors, or it's about how do you engage people in a process from the beginning. And so, if the outcome is, if you want to influence policymakers, and you're doing a piece of research on education, who better to be involved in your research than students? Because they're on the ground. They will bring, and again, it's not just students. It's about they're not sort of one group of students and they'll influence everything. It's about how do you diversify as much as possible, and that's why I put immersive or immerse. Because you need to involve people in different ways in the process. So the Piccadilly Circus example that I gave, we have been working on a part of that project, and we have been working with designers. So it's not just about our energy and environment researchers, desk researchers. It's about people who could actually help design a city centre of the future. Now, these are massive steps, big steps for us. And, most of our research still is developed in a fairly traditional way. But you can only, in a communication sense, you can only have successful comms if you're producing content that appeals to the end audience. That's for sure. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But I would say that it's the same with the way that we develop research now, and the whole process of developing research. It needs to be inclusive, and it needs to take into account of different experiences, people on the ground. It doesn't mean that desk research is wrong, or they wouldn't do that anyway, but to be credible, you need to have a process that involves the doctors.
Thank you.
Now, someone else had a hand up, but Marco, are you done, or?
Yeah, I just wanted a brief comment on relation. I'm sorry, I don't want to turn on my camera because my internet is unstable, really. Just a brief comment related to the relations between the researcher and communications persons. I think that one of the crucial things is to build that relation from the very beginning of the development of the project. Actually, at the moment when you try to apply for some funds, etc. Because when you do that at the very beginning, there is less room to do in this or that way, but you have some kind of strategy already set. But on the other side, you have a context, and you have some developments that could influence this, how you set up your communication related to some project. And that is because of that, you need to adjust the communication, no matter how hard you tried to set it up in some other direction. And that is, I think, really important to try to hook on some developments and to try to connect your project outcomes with those developments that are developing in the outside world.
I think that's very true, and I can definitely give examples of projects where to go right back, you'd start a research project, you do your research, and then you publish a report 6 months later. And in the meantime, the world is moving on. So I can definitely give examples, from Chatham House, and I hope everyone else could as well, of where you're able to flex, as you said, and to be, to actually, you can release I know that we were conducting a survey on European immigration, and we wanted to release part of the survey because there was a big debate on immigration, and it wasn't, I think, what was being presented in the media at the time. Get what the story was, but anyway, we had evidence from a survey that was like, no, it's not like that. The public isn't as hostile to immigration as the government is making out. So we released some data, and it went down incredibly well. But you know, we were slightly hesitant because we were releasing the findings of a survey without the context. We produced that sort of expert comment with it, but I think it's really important, as you say, to be able to flex and to draw on content as and when it's going to perhaps do something for you, and maybe something unexpected or unintended. But I think that's a really good point, and certainly to your first point, absolutely essential. And that sounds like you've got something good going. So which key stakeholders is Chatham House targeting? And sorry, Rawan. One, what indicators to use for assessment and benchmarking? What are the available standards? Well, you can set your own benchmarks. So, you know, for our sort of online articles for expert comment, if they're read by 1,300 people, then we take that as a success. And what we try to do is to make sure that everyone reaches that benchmark, and then you can move it up and move it on. But my point for us is, because we're a relatively large organization, we have a lot of outputs, we try to flex accordingly. So some papers, some outputs may only want to reach half a dozen people, or a sort of wider general audience, and maybe some media specialists or some peers and think tanks. So you need that's why it's important to be clear about the objective and to factor that into the strategy, and then the tactics. You adjust the tactics as you go, as you find actually it's not going to be of much interest to the media, but it will be of interest to, you know, our peer think tanks. So the indicators for assessment, I mean, I guess for social media, you use social media or media monitoring. So, you know, we use Google Analytics. We have dashboards for all the research programs and for some of the bigger projects, so that people can track engagement over a period of time, over a period of weeks, or sometimes they're up for longer. And then we report back generally on, you know, who's had the most interviews, which tweet. Every Monday we do a kind of weekly all staff meeting where we report on what worked on social media the week before. You know, we tried, I think for the first time, we tried a poll on social media on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and we linked it to an expert comment, but we were asking our Twitter followers to just vote on a topic. It was just a little experiment, but you know, if that worked and did well and led lots of people to read the expert comment, then we would report back on that. And yeah, the benchmarking it's harder, but it's because you set it yourself, and you need to set something that's challenging. But we tend to know ourselves. We tend to be realistic amongst the teams, amongst the research programs, about what they're trying to achieve. So I hope that's answered your question a little bit, Rowan. Sophie, which key stakeholders are we targeting? Has communication to a more general public gained in importance? Again, a little bit as my previous answer, it can be different for different outputs, but for sure, our core target audience are policymakers. And you know, in international institutions, in governments, we had a very successful initiative with the Halo Trust on landmine clearance in Angola, where we worked with the government in Angola. They committed $60 million to landmine clearance, but we were working with, you know, Brussels, with Washington, and within London. So, you know, all of those groups are equally important. The general public there, yeah, they were quite interested, and Prince Harry was involved because that was his trust. So that was publicity, but that was publicity for him, not really for Chatham House. But you know, success there was always going to be clearing the actual landmines. And so that objective was reached. That's a huge success for us. Not everything's like that, but knowing from the outset that these are the stakeholders for that project was important. The G7 work that I just mentioned, we're publishing 8 reports. They're going to be for the leaders in the G7, but specifically for the UK government. We don't always target the UK government, but we have a series of papers. The media will be really important because the eyes of the world will be on the G7 at that time in June. And then there will be interest from the general public. So we will produce assets that will appeal to the general public. So again, key stakeholders are different at every turn, but these are probably the main 3. So I hope that answers your question, Sophie. Okay, what I'm going to do, I will go back to the slide, and again, please just interrupt if there's anything that isn't clear. Target audiences, there you go. And of course, I didn't mention there are the supporters. Your funders are always important. Okay, channels. We've kind of covered this, so I'm going to move on to the exercise. But select your channels, really important. And even down to one-to-one meetings, you need to know who you want to reach. It's always great. I mean, we launched a report in January on global Britain's place in the world post-Brexit. And, we know the individual MPs. We know that we needed to try and get the report on the desk, or at least to the special advisor of the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, which we did, as well as key individuals in Parliament, the chair of the Select Committee, the opposition, and so on. So these are like individuals who we will actively target, as I'm sure you all do. Now, one thing that we haven't really touched on is frequency. Timing is so important, especially on digital channels. When you send your emails, how often you post. Your content needs space to breathe all the time. You can't crowd out your content or inundate your audience. So please be very, very thoughtful about that approach. And there are a lot of information on when it's best to post. You'll get, for those of you who have a database who send bulk emails, you will know what the open rates are. You'll be able to flex the subject line. And if it works one week, then there's a good chance it will work the next week or the next month. And that's not always the case, but please be really careful when you think about the frequency and timing and so on. And then some of this we've touched on. I will maybe jump and describe how we do it, which I think is the next slide. But there are all sorts of metrics and KPIs and methods of evaluation that funders will ask for. Even the anecdotal, we keep a bank of nuggets when someone just sends an email and says, thanks for the report, really interesting read, as long as someone's significant. The way that we report our impact, mostly internally, but also back to funders and supporters, is we categorize in these 4 areas. Broadly speaking, outreach is almost the comms element. That's what we do. It's the numbers. We know that we have reached, X number of followers on Twitter, that 2,000 people read the expert comment, and 1,800 went to the report and downloaded it. So we call that outreach. Engagement is much more one-to-one. So that's where we might meet a minister or run an event or a roundtable, have a discussion, have a group of individuals that we can almost identify. That's more how we measure engagement. It's like, who are the real key players and did we reach them? The influence comes, and I'm simplifying this a little bit or quite a bit, but the influence comes when we know that something's gone into a white paper, or there has been an acknowledgement in a policy document in government circles that we have reached them and they have heard us, they have listened to us, or even taken on board our recommendations. So that we broadly measure as influence. And then implementation comes when something changes. Our global health team did a really good piece of work on hospital detentions. There are a number of countries in the world where, you know, where if you're in hospital, you can't afford to pay the bill, you're detained. And some people are detained for months and months, even years. And we were part of a consortium that did a big piece of research on this. Rob Yates, who's the head of our global health team, we worked with the New York Times, and they did like a 2 or 3 day feature on all of the issues that arose, and then policy change in individual countries. And, you know, that was real. Now, the landmine example and that example that I've given are few and far between. You know, we don't claim to have changed, you know, the world in that way, in such an obvious and direct way too often. But when it happens, it's really important for us. So these are the 4 ways that we tend to engage, that we tend to report on our impact. Someone else. I will just quickly look at the chat. Oh, that's a great question. So from a range of sources. So if it's a bulk email, it's our email provider. If it's on social media, it's the stats that we can see. We do use a digital marketing agency. So if we run a campaign, we launched a series of videos called Imagine a Better World. And we used an external agency to do the digital marketing to make sure that, you know, that they were tracking and responding. And I think they promoted the videos on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on Facebook. And the cost benefit of promoting on LinkedIn, I think it was LinkedIn that didn't work. It was Facebook that worked really well. So we got the vast majority of viewers and engagement from Facebook. So using that data, we then posted the other videos more and promoted them more on Facebook. So, you know, email, social media, as I said before, I think the media stats, we use anecdotal measurements, we use our own benchmarks, the analytics from the website. We know that if we're coming up highly in search engine rankings, that we're doing a good job. So it's a combination of all of the above. How do you do it? Has that answered your question?
Yes, I see that part of outreach, yes, when we're talking about people that are reading us, and it's from Causa Natural, by the way. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself.
That's all right.
But the other parts in the scale, I mean, outreach, but later we have engagement, influence, and implementation. And this how do you get the measure for influence? Is this always the thing about us? I mean,
yeah,
you can communicate a lot, but is that key person don't read it or don't get it? Of course, we can always ask them, but sometimes it's very difficult to know what is happening in the close circle of the decision makers.
Yeah, and look, this is, so I know that, so the report I mentioned, the Global Britain influence, we'll keep a database that we report back to our council, and the database on it will have, you know, under that category, influence. We will just literally type in the database. I mean, there's no, or we maybe cut and paste from, you know, or add it as, you know, as a comment box. But we will say that the Foreign Office requested a copy of the report. The special advisor to the Secretary of State read it. The feedback, literally, we've got a feedback from the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It was mentioned when he wrote, it was mentioned a little bit critically, but it was mentioned when he wrote an article in the Times, and then there was some follow-up commentary on that. So, you know, that's influence engagement, but we know that we have influenced the thinking to a degree of the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And I know that there are other examples from industry, from, you know, we circulated that to our partners, to our peer groups, and there was real engagement. Our director really engaged on social media when we launched this. He answered criticism, he answered questions, he drew out and sort of gave a further explanation. So, you know, again, that's more engagement than influence, but it did actually influence the discussion. And then you could even say that I think that Global Britain, for a short period of time that week, if you searched for global Britain, it was coming like top. His report was coming sort of top 5 in Google rankings. It's gone right down now, but at the time, that was, again, that's a really good demonstration of engagement. Now, we wouldn't normally expect that from our report, especially a more technical report, but we're looking out for those things all the time, and then we will report on. Maybe there's some things we missed, but because it isn't an exact science, but we will look out for those examples, and we want to share those examples internally, and then we want to learn from them and then repeat them the next time. And we know the next time that if we entitle a report, or we know that global Britain worked because it worked in the search rankings, the next time, America first, or not America first anymore, something that might work. So we might consider using that in the title, as long as it works with the researcher. So,
thank you.
Okay, the next step was, I don't know how we are for time. We're a bit rushed now. 20 minutes, okay, that's good. So what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe even just to go back to think about the example of losing weight. There's a kind of quick and short approach to identifying an objective, thinking about what broadly a strategy would be, and then just think about some tactics. And you can think about the tactics in the sort of the 5 categories that I gave you. And I'll go back, I'll leave the slide up. You think about, how will you deliver your objective, and make it one that applies to your work. We're not going to have time to go over it, but make it one that applies to your work if you like. But what I thought was, if you want an idea, devise a strategy and some tactics for this objective, which is attract a younger, more diverse audience to our events. So what broadly would your strategy be? What tactics would you need to adopt to make it happen? I'll just do a quick check on the chat. Okay, thank you, Andrea. And in the meantime, so I'm going to leave it up to you to just write down. Andrea, do you want to talk through the process, because it's going to be on the board? Is that right?
Yeah. So I just we're using the Menti survey that we did. So instead of doing a group work, we'll do it all together. So if you go to Menti, as we've been using, and write down this code, you please do what Keith was just saying, but do it here so we can all see as everybody is thinking. This might take a couple of minutes while people think, though.
Yeah, no, of course. Or do it for losing weight, or do it for something personal. Do it for one, but just try and keep it simple. Think about the objective. That should be easy. Think about or at least clear. Think about the broad strategy, and then some tactics. And then where you can, try and think about the outputs, the audiences, the channel, the frequency, and the measurement. There's no exact science. There's no perfect way to do this, but those are the key components that you should be thinking about. Okay, so I'm going to leave it. Can I make a couple of comments? Be more visible on social media is great, and everybody wants that. So you could be more specific about the objective. Be the leading think tank in your country or your sector on social media, because then it's just easier to measure. Reach out to young social media influencers and students at universities. That's great. And again, perhaps a bit more specific would help because if you think of the very first one I gave, win the general election, lose 20 kilos, there when you've reached your target. So and as I said, I think at one point, be realistic. You can set a challenge and then you can exceed it, or you can set a challenge for the next 6 months, set an objective for the next 6 months, and then expand it when you look like it's achievable.
Let me know if you want me to scroll down, Keith.
Scroll down, yes, please, just to see them all. So I've got why don't we sort of take a couple of examples and talk them through? Would that work, rather than everyone, and then
Yeah.
Objective. So should we start with that one? That looks like objective. Reach 1,000 engagement on Facebook page, strategy, Facebook boost tactics, and then quiz program boost with I didn't quite so I understand the objective, 1,000 engagement on Facebook page, then boost the yeah, I do. Facebook boost. Who put that one up? Because I think that's
It's me.
Hello.
Yes, I'm Kai from Myanmar.
Hello.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, do you know where you are at the moment on Facebook?
Actually, we have our organization have many different kind of Facebook, because in our country, Facebook is the most popular social media and the most communication channel among our community levels and among our target audience.
Okay.
Actually, I didn't remember the target, the reach and the like number of our Facebook page, but this is just like the example, because due to based on the true story, we increased a lot of engagement and like person in last year December.
Okay, so but I would say if Facebook's really popular, is that objective a realistic objective if lots of people are using it? So 1,000 compared to other think tanks, would that sort of take you above them, or is my question, is that a little bit unambitious, I guess?
No, actually, what we did is like that. Like for example, like in 2021, we did our communication plans and communication indicator. So at that time, based on the previous year experience and previous year achievement, we achieved we did our benchmark and our indicator. So like for example, like if in last year 2020, one of our Facebook page reached like 5,000 engagement or 5,000 likes, something like that. So at that time, based on that experience, we believe that we can reach that kind of target.
Okay.
This is one of our objective.
That makes sense. And so the tactics are, you've got quiz, program, boost with target audience. So you're developing some specific initiatives that you know will attract the audience, yes?
Yes, right. Because it depends on also the audience nature. Because in December, our main target is that we are mainly target on the university level student. My organization is mainly focused on the gender-based violence and equality. So our mainly targets on the university students. So they are interested in to participate like game show or quiz show, something like that.
Okay.
That's why that is quiz program.
I think that's really important, and I'm going to move to the one next to you, which is the objective, reach a younger audience. Reach a younger audience. The strategy is everything goes digital except long reads. Set up a social media account, start production team for podcasts. I think that's really good. I would say for that one, I don't know who posted that one, but the objective of reach a younger audience again is quite broad. So you don't, do you know if you have 10 people, is that a success, or is it something wider? Everything goes digital as a strategy is great. That's digital first approach and then some. And of course, it's probably very appropriate for the time. But again, I like the tactics. There are a lot of tactics in there. And fact sheets sounds really important. I would just make a comment more generally for everybody, for all think tanks, that we know at the moment there's such a huge amount of information, and we all have information overload. If you can get yourself in a position where you are seen as a trusted source of information, then I think that's an important, it's almost an obligation, almost a moral obligation on all of us, because there is so much bad information, disinformation out there, misleading information. But to become a credible source of information, of course, you have to have a gateway. You have to have a way in. And a way in for a younger audience is going to be starting with, information sheets, explainers, And you can do that in writing, you can do it online, and you can offer something positive through that. So I think some of those suggestions there are great. Can we move back up, Andrea, to the top? I'm just quite interested in someone put an academy, create young ambassadors for the think tank, different universities or CSOs of the country. I think that's a really, really good and important idea. The person who put that up? Are you?
Yes, hi, it's Danya from Tunisia.
Hi, Danya, how are you?
Thank you. Actually, it's kind of you triggered this idea because I thought it was a genius thing to have a young panel, a young advisory panel. And because I want to create a think and do tank in the education, well, to try and contribute to the educational sector, it was kind of a light bulb. You know, it's like, okay, I need them on board. And how can I do that? It's literally by outreach engagement, in your sense of engagement on the one-to-one, and having them represent, because very often, well, I've worked in communications for a very long time, including at the World Bank, and the best communications is when somebody speaks on your behalf, not you speaking directly.
Absolutely.
And so that would be a best approach. If a young person talks to another young person, they'd be more inclined to listen and to actually at least take the time and think about it. So that was my thought behind it.
I think it's a great idea. So I could just very quickly, and I'll share my email. So if anyone wants to follow up, then please send me a message. But for our panel of young advisors, we wanted to mirror in number the panel of senior advisors. We wanted to incorporate them into the structure, the formal structure of the organization, so that they know we mean business. And then we basically went through a recruitment process. And the recruitment process was that we advertised. We made it clear that it's, they're not, there's no pay, and it's a voluntary thing. We would expect them to meet, 3, maybe 4 times per year. And what happened at the first meeting was that we gave them, although they'd all met each other offline, we gave them 45 seconds to give us their idea about what's the one thing you would like to see Chatham House do in the next 2 years. So, more presence on Instagram, right up to mentoring. They came up with some really good ideas. I can send you this information, don't worry. And then they wanted to hear from our leadership. So our chair, our director, our deputy director, each gave like 3 or 4 minutes on the state of the world and where they thought Chatham House was going. And they loved that. So questions and answers. And then they'd been pre-arranged, but they had 4 presentations. One was on, how we can make the most of sort of youth organization partners, it was social media. There was one on partnering other organizations, and then there was one on mentoring. So they gave us mentorings and internships. So they gave us their ideas of what they would like us to see, and we gave them some insights from the leadership of the team. And now the other challenge is that they are enthusiastic. So we've got to keep going. So we're saying, do you want to write for the magazine? Are you interested in this research project because there's an event? So it takes quite a bit of coordination, like getting them on board and recruiting them and get them to buy into the organization is so important. And then it's going to be a 2-way exchange. But I'm sure my email's somewhere, but I'll happily follow up and give you more information.
Thank you.
And the same goes for everyone. I'll just put this. I'm happily look through all of those ideas, but it might be better. I think Andrea's going to be really firm on time. Does anyone have any final comments or questions? I'm sorry, it was a little bit disjointed. I hope you got something out of this, but does anyone have any comments or final questions or any challenges? Because it's always going to be developing a communication strategy is always going to be, there are generalities, but there are specifics, and every organization works in a different way. And sometimes it's just not possible to, get everybody to buy into it. So that's fine. But, I would say, don't be too prescriptive. Find out what works for you, for your organization, And you will know, if you're honest, everybody's honest about it, you will know when you have success, and when you don't have success, you will know when there's room for improvement. So plug away. But yeah, does anybody have any final comments or questions?
Yes, I mean, just for final comments, if you want to give some advice about the kind of the journey to be, I know Chatham House is a well-known and one of the best, or is already seen in this year list of the most influential think tanks. But thinking about your communication strategy, if you will give advice to a new think tank or young think tank about how to be this known and influential think tanks, considering communications, what will be the steps to follow? You go with your mark, to be known. You go to decision makers. How do you construct this image and this image that support you in your work, trying to influence and to change policy?
That's a really good question, and there is no easy answer. I would say that the thing that you have to do is be sincere and be clear about your objectives, however big or small, and be true to yourself. You, as an organization, as a person, you need to know what you're good at and what your purpose is. You know, Chatham House is a big think tank. We have been around for a long time, but there's a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl who arguably has got, well, who does have a much bigger profile, who has probably changed the world more than Chatham House has. I don't know. But, you know, it's not necessarily about size and resource. If you can be a schoolgirl like Malala Yousafzai, if you can be somebody who can enact change because you hook onto something, the time is right, the person's right, the idea's right, that's what will be successful, not whether you have a big organization and a big social media department or, you know, almost even the right strategy. That's important, but what will make you successful is being true to yourself and being realistic about what you can achieve. And I'm sure Greta Thunberg, you know, if she was thinking, how do I, you know, influence the world and speak at the UN, you know, it's not going to happen by design. It's going to happen by just by hitting the zeitgeist and saying something that resonates with people. So that's what's ultimately going to be successful. There are so many small organizations, and I heard something on the radio yesterday about Bellingcat, and you know they have 27 journalists. They have changed journalism. They have brought some of the biggest stories to the front. The Salisbury poisoning in the UK, many other examples, and you know they have done it just because they saw a gap. They saw a time. They thought, well, there's all this data and information that's coming through on social media, and are the traditional newspapers really doing much with it? No, they weren't. So there's a gap. They are credible. They are doing something that's worthwhile. So that's obviously a bonus, and that's great. But yeah, don't be too focused on size. Just think about the idea, the concept, and think what individuals can do.
Thanks, Keith. That was really good. I like the end of it. Being true and being realistic about what you can do, and managing your work. So unless there's any,
could I just say something really quickly? That also right here, right now, something might not seem important, but in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, it could become really important, and you could be the think tank that's working on it that lots of people turn to. So that's important as well. The work, anyway, yeah, I'll leave it at that.